Hello and welcome to day 10 of Unsourced's Christmas Carol-A-Thon. Today we're going to be taking a look at the 1964 production Carol for Another Christmas, directed by Joseph Mankiewicz, which, given who wrote it, makes it really odd that I haven't actually heard much about this version from anyone. It never really seems to come up. And that's shocking because the talent behind it in front of the camera is impeccable. It's written by Rod Serling, who needs no further introduction, and stars Sterling Hayden, Peter Sellers, Pat Hingle, and with music by Henry Mancini. It's a veritable who's who, which might make you wonder why it seems to have been kind of buried, to the point that it has had no official physical release, and it's only rarely been redistributed. The biggest of which apparently only being a streaming premiere to HBO Max in 2021, and it's still there at least. But, let's dig into it. I think the best way to distinguish this adaptation from the others is that it makes really bold choices. That is not to denigrate the others, but those usually use the story to elucidate and wax poetic on the general themes of humanity, goodwill toward men, the spirit of giving, the Christmas Carol hallmarks. While you're not really gonna get that with Carol for Another Christmas, not exactly. No, Rod Serling comes in with a big message that he's gonna make sure the viewer understands, which makes sense. Serling's iconic Twilight Zone series was known for its moral-driven storytelling, and this is very much in that vein in terms of making sure the narrative has a singular purpose. But let's backtrack a bit and see how exactly this plays out. Sterling Hayden plays our resident Scrooge this time around, a bitter, cynical, and disillusioned old naval commander by the name of Daniel Grudge, which is just a beautiful name, who spends every Christmas since the death of his son, who was killed overseas after following in his father's footsteps, alone with his memories. The opulence of the surroundings, the coldness of everything, and the emphasis on his hermit-like nature gives off some real Citizen Kane vibes, and you can't help but wonder if this wasn't at least a bit inspired by that film. Now, the movie kicks off with thematic core early on, the first introducing this film's version of Scrooge's nephew Fred, who is also called Fred. And that's rather funny to note because Scrooge's name was the only one changed. Fred here also pulls double duty as the charity fundraisers, visiting his uncle for help with one of his social causes, a list of which Grudge mocks with disdain. In this case, a cultural exchange program Fred was spearheading with Poland that Grudge has blocked. As it turns out, Grudge's military mindset, as well as the loss of his son, and what he feels was a war the US got into through preening and unnecessary sympathies, has made him an isolationist, a borderline nationalist, and a slight objectivist, his worldview on global politics basically being the fuck you got mine approach. America is for the Americans, bootstraps, and all aid, olive branches, and diplomatic outreach are at best pointless and at worst harmful to American perseverance and resources. Classic bootstrap stuff. Cold War fears of letting the unknown other in. And Grudge exposits upon all this at length in a very tacitly written dialogue exchange. And that's kind of the big mark against this version of the story. Not that any version is subtle, but the more direct and specifically political and social themes added means that they start to break things down a bit, in a way that becomes a little more than blatant. There's just an aesthetic and emotional difference between characters espousing more universal ideals about kindness than there is about a speech about the ideology behind mutually assured destruction, which, really does happen and it's incredible. But, it's not altogether bad. Much like the previous Americanized adaptation, An American Christmas Carol, it marks this retelling as indelibly American, full of unmistakably American fears, flaws, and hopes. One film has the ever-consuming drive of industrialization and capitalism, and here we see the ideals of war hawks and military might-is-right geopolitics. It's bold, and makes this adaptation unique and gives it a precise identity. The direction by producer/director Joseph Mankiewicz is absolutely incredible as well. He perfectly creates this eerie and surreal atmosphere to the story that basically gives us the feel of a long Twilight Zone episode. Hell, one of my favorite episodes of that show was about a father spending one last day with the spirit of his son as he's about to die overseas. And that sense of love and loss between a father and son is also part of the crux of this story as well. It kind of informs Grudge's every emotion. Hell, when we get to the Coast of Christmas Past, he's less Christmas Past as he is symbolic of dead soldiers around the world. He is a statement being made to chip away at the notion that while Grudge's loss is personal to him, doesn't mean such losses aren't also universal, and acting as they are is a zero-sum game of narcissism and solipsism. And the Ghost of Christmas Past himself is just absolutely wonderful. The performance is stirring, dynamic, and hell, it's really damn intimidating. But you know, it's not really about Christmas. It's about dead soldiers and of the way people can partition off casualties of different countries as just numbers. And that's really the rub with this movie. The fact that it takes place on Christmas is almost ancillary, a reference point for what people recognize as having meaning, so that there's an inherent sense of juxtaposition and contrast. You know, Christmas, and then we're having this very, very dour and depressing story of war. But not much else has made use of it. It could have taken place at any other time of the year. To really put a pin in this notion, the big flashback that Christmas Past relays to Grudge is not a previous Christmas or some sort of inciting event in Grudge's history about Christmas, but of Grudge visiting a group of schoolgirls during World War II who were caught in the outskirts of the atomic bomb and who are slowly dying of radiation burns. It is harrowing and shocking, and it legitimately made me sick to my stomach. The writing and direction and the performances are just too emotionally impactful. It really did just shock me to my core. And you know, the scene is powerful, but what does it have to do with Christmas? So I think that's what probably turned a lot of people off with this film, especially as a Christmas Carol adaptation that was broadcast around the Christmas season. The Ghost Christmas Present is a little more on point, played as a more menacing and cynical figure by Pat Hingle, who castigates Grudge on his indifference to suffering and his cold, analytical point of view toward turning a blind eye on charity. But it's a little less set up because there was no charity fundraisers in this version except for Fred, and it's not really that much of a sort of callback or payoff to a previous instance like other carols do. But the intent and execution is still the same and has impact. But then we get to the Ghost of Christmas Future, and this is where things just get weird. The sequence is about a nuclear post-apocalypse. America has fallen into a wasteland ruled by a tyrannical cowboy played by Peter Sellers, who governs through a doctrine of selfishness. Like, that's it. They call themselves the Me Empire, because it's all about me, you know. Just, I get it, Serling. I get it. You're making a point here, but it feels like something out of a Robert Crumb comic. And yes, there's not much else to say about it, because it's so blunt. It's so in your face. It doesn't leave anything to chance when it comes to portraying caution of what America's isolationism and what America's sort of self-centeredness and sort of self-concerns might lead to in the most overtly perfunctory and stripped down form. And that's the best and most kindest way I can place this ridiculous segment. Because overall, it seemed like a very on-the-nose way to put a button on the prevailing themes of this adaptation. But the thing is, after some very intense and grounded segments, it's just too kooky for words. Overall, the movie is an engaging watch. Critics at the time called it meandering and dull and overly written and overly lecturing, and they're not exactly wrong. I think anyone going into this expecting a regular entertaining Christmas Carol adaptation is going to be blindsided. But despite its divergences and a lack of stronger character cores, Serling and the actors imbue such power and raw emotion into the words that Serling wrote, and the way that Mankiewicz is able to bring all this together along with the themes they want to explore is honestly riveting nonetheless. And while this might not make it into my rotation, it's definitely going to stick with me for a while, and I definitely recommend it if something this outrageous sounds good to you and if you're interested in seeing a bit more of a kind of manifesto from Rod Serling, because he does leave everything on the table. And I think on that aspect, just seeing like what his sort of ideas of what he thought in his time were very important issues and probably still are to a lot of people is well worth to watch either way. Anyway, overall 8 out of 10. I had a real good time with this one, even though I had some complaints. Let me know what you think below. Are you going to watch this? Are you interested in watching this? You know, even though you've heard everything I've said. And leave a like, comment, subscribe. And see you again for day number 11.